Imagine this. A highly decorated U.S. Army general, dressed in full uniform, gets pulled over by a police officer. But instead of a routine stop, things take a dark turn. The officer, blinded by prejudice, refuses to acknowledge the general's rank and treats him like a common criminal. Handcuffs tighten, rights are ignored, and the humiliation begins. But just 20 minutes later, a single phone call changes everything. The officer's face turns pale, his arrogance vanishes, and suddenly, he's the one in deep trouble. What happened in those crucial 20 minutes? And how did one call flip the script? Stay with us till the end to find out. Racial profiling by law enforcement isn't new, but when it happens to someone as high-ranking as a U.S. Army general, the consequences are shocking. This isn't just a case of mistaken identity. It's about arrogance, bias, and a total disregard for respect. What happens when power is misused? And how does a simple phone call bring justice? This story will keep you on the edge of your seat as we break down every moment. Stay tuned, because the twist in this tale is one you won't see coming. It all started on a quiet evening when U.S. Army General James Carter, a highly decorated officer with over 30 years of service, was driving home after attending a military conference. Dressed in his full uniform, his car bore official military plates, making it clear that he was no ordinary citizen. As he approached a stoplight, he noticed a police cruiser pull up behind him. Moments later, flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. General Carter calmly pulled over, expecting a routine stop, perhaps a minor traffic violation or a misunderstanding. But as soon as the officer stepped out, things felt off. Officer Mark Reynolds, a local cop with a history of complaints for racial profiling, approached the vehicle with an aggressive stance. His hand rested on his holster, and his eyes scanned Carter with clear suspicion. "Under license and registration," Reynolds barked. The general, maintaining his composure, responded, "Officer, is there a reason I'm being pulled over?" Reynolds frowned. "You don't ask the questions here. Hand over your documents." Without hesitation, General Carter reached for his military ID and driver's license. "I'm a U.S. Army general. My name is James Carter. This is my personal vehicle, but it has military plates. If there's an issue, I'd be happy to clarify." But instead of acknowledging the general's rank, Officer Reynolds scoffed. "I don't care who you are. Military or not, you follow my orders." Things escalated quickly. Reynolds claimed that Carter was acting suspiciously and demanded that he step out of the vehicle. Despite the general's calm demeanor, Reynolds grew increasingly aggressive. Passers-by began to take notice, some even recording the incident on their phones. "Step out of the car now," Reynolds shouted, unholstering his weapon. At this point, General Carter knew this was no ordinary traffic stop. This was racial profiling at its worst. He raised his hands slowly, ensuring no sudden movements, and stepped out. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Reynolds ordered. "Officer, you're making a mistake." Carter tried to reason with him, but it was no use. Within seconds, he felt cold steel tighten around his wrists. The humiliation of being handcuffed in broad daylight, despite his decades of service to the country, was unbearable. By now, a small crowd had gathered, murmuring among themselves. Some recognized the general, whispering in disbelief. "That's General Carter. What's going on?" But Reynolds was too caught up in his power trip to care. He radioed in, falsely claiming he had detained a suspicious individual refusing to cooperate. The general, now sitting on the curb, remained calm but firm. "Officer, you're going to regret this decision," he said. Reynolds smirked. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Little did he know, the answer to that question was just 20 minutes away. As General Carter sat on the curb, his hands bound behind his back, he remained eerily calm. This wasn't the first time he had faced adversity, but it was certainly one of the most humiliating. He had served his country with honor, commanded thousands of soldiers, and advised top government officials. And yet, here he was, treated like a criminal by a man who refused to see beyond his own prejudice. The crowd around them grew larger, and murmurs of protest could be heard. Some onlookers were recording the incident, and a few were even calling out to the officer. That's General Carter. He's a decorated war hero. One man shouted. Why are you treating him like this? Another woman demanded. But Officer Reynolds wasn't listening. His mind was set. In his eyes, Carter was just another suspect, another man he could push around without consequences. He turned to the bystanders with an authoritative glare. Everyone back up. This is a police matter. If you don't move, I'll start making more arrests. Reynolds barked. The general, however, refused to let the situation spiral further. Even in this moment of injustice, he remained composed. Officer Reynolds, I'm advising you one last time. Call your superior. Right now, Carter said in a firm yet measured tone. Reynolds scoffed. Oh, now you're giving me orders? That's cute. He turned away, ignoring Carter's words, and continued filling out paperwork on the hood of his patrol car. Meanwhile, something was happening that Reynolds didn't know about. A bystander had already taken action. A retired Marine standing among the crowd had seen enough. He quietly pulled out his phone and made a call. Sir, this is Sergeant Walker. We have a situation. General James Carter has just been detained by a local officer. It's bad. You need to act fast. The voice on the other end immediately understood the gravity of the situation. The wheels of justice were now in motion. Minutes passed, and Reynolds remained oblivious to the storm that was about to hit him. He walked back toward Carter, shaking his head. You really think your little uniform means anything to me? He sneered. People like you always think you're above the law. Carter's expression didn't change. He simply responded, People like me? What exactly do you mean by that, officer? Reynolds hesitated for a brief moment, realizing he had said too much. But before he could recover, his radio crackled to life. Unit 17, this is Chief Daniels. Report your status immediately. Reynolds frowned. It wasn't common for the police chief himself to call in directly. He picked up the radio. Chief, I have a suspect in custody for resisting orders and acting suspiciously. There was a long pause. Then, the chief's voice came back, now filled with urgency. Release him. Right now. Reynolds' face twisted in confusion. Excuse me, sir? Officer Reynolds, I don't think you understand what I'm saying. You have just detained a sitting U.S. Army general. I am giving you a direct order. Uncuff him immediately and apologize. If you don't, you'll regret it. A sinking feeling settled in Reynolds' stomach. His arrogance started to fade as he looked down at Carter, who still sat patiently on the curb. You really are a general? Reynolds muttered. Carter gave a small nod. I told you that 20 minutes ago. Realizing the gravity of his mistake, Reynolds fumbled with the handcuff keys. His hands shook slightly as he hurried to undo what he had just done. The once mighty officer, who had been so full of authority, now looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. The moment the cuffs came off, Carter stood up, rolling his wrists. The crowd around them erupted, some in anger, some in disbelief. But before anyone could act, another sound pierced the air. A convoy of black SUVs came roaring down the street. Reynolds stepped back, his face pale. This was about to get much, much worse for him. As the black SUVs screeched to a halt, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The crowd, already murmuring in disbelief, fell silent. The doors of the lead vehicle swung open, and out stepped Brigadier General Thomas Reynolds, a senior military official, flanked by two stern-faced military police officers. Officer Mark Reynolds, still recovering from the shock of realizing his mistake, took an unconscious step backward. His face turned an even paler shade as he registered the name embroidered on the chest of the approaching military leader. Reynolds, the same last name as his? Oh no, he muttered under his breath. Brigadier General Thomas Reynolds was not just any officer. He was Officer Mark Reynolds' own uncle. The tension in the air became suffocating. The elder Reynolds approached with a gaze so cold and unforgiving that the younger officer swallowed hard. The crowd, sensing something even bigger unfolding, stepped back slightly, giving space to the military officials. Sir, what in the name of God have you done? Sir, Brigadier General Reynolds' voice was dangerously low, but it carried enough force to make his nephew flinch. Officer Mark Reynolds stammered. I didn't know, sir. He didn't identify himself properly. Enough. The general's voice cut through his words like a blade. He turned to General Carter, who had just finished rubbing his wrists where the handcuffs had left faint red marks. Sir General Carter, are you all right? He asked with a deep, professional respect. Carter, ever composed, nodded. Sir, I've been through worse, but I will say, this was one of the more insulting experiences I've had. Sir, Brigadier General Reynolds clenched his jaw, exhaling sharply before turning back to his nephew. His expression was unreadable, but the weight of disappointment in his eyes was heavier than any words could convey. Do you have any idea what you've just done? He finally asked. Officer Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came out. He glanced at the crowd, the cameras still recording, and the other police officers who had arrived on the scene, watching in complete silence. You didn't just unlawfully detain a citizen. You didn't just disrespect an officer of the United States Army, the general continued. You racially profiled a high-ranking military leader and publicly humiliated a man who has served this country for decades. Mark Reynolds' hands trembled slightly. He looked around, searching for an escape, but there was none. Then, a voice came through the police radio once again. Officer Mark Reynolds, you are hereby relieved of duty pending an internal investigation. Return to the station immediately. His face crumbled. The arrogance, the superiority, it was all gone. In its place was the grim realization that his career was collapsing before his eyes. Sir, please, He tried to appeal to his uncle, but the general only shook his head. No, you don't get to plead now. Actions have consequences. With those words, two internal affairs officers stepped forward. One of them spoke. Officer Mark Reynolds, turn in your badge and firearm. The crowd gasped. The cameras caught every second of it. Mark Reynolds hesitated, his hands hovering over his utility belt. Then, finally, he unfastened the belt and handed it over. His badge followed. The once proud police officer now stood as a disgraced man, his future uncertain. Meanwhile, General Carter watched the scene unfold, not with satisfaction, but with a solemn awareness of the deeper issue at hand. This wasn't just about one racist officer. It was about a system that allowed people like him to abuse their power. As Mark Reynolds was led toward one of the police vehicles, the crowd erupted. Not in anger, but in relief. Justice had been served, but the battle against injustice was far from over. Brigadier General Reynolds turned back to General Carter. Sir, I can't undo what happened, but I give you my word, he will face the full consequences. Carter nodded. Sir, I appreciate that, General, but this isn't just about me. This is about every person who has been mistreated because of the color of their skin. I just hope this serves as a wake-up call. The two men exchanged a firm handshake, a silent understanding passing between them. The military police officers returned to their vehicles, and the convoy prepared to leave. As General Carter got into his car, now free to go, the weight of the moment settled in. He had faced discrimination before, but this time, the world had watched. And this time, justice had been swift. But one question remained. How many others had suffered similar treatment without anyone to stand up for them? As General Carter drove away from the scene, his mind was heavy. He had faced many challenges throughout his distinguished career, but what had just happened felt different, personal in a way that reached beyond the incident itself. The public humiliation, the racial profiling, the sheer disregard for his authority as an officer of the United States Army, it all weighed on him. But what troubled him most was the thought that this wasn't just an isolated event. It was a symptom of a much deeper problem. As he drove through the quiet streets, he couldn't help but reflect on the moment when Officer Mark Reynolds had refused to listen to him, when he had ignored the rank and status Carter had earned over a lifetime of service. It wasn't just about him being disrespected. It was about the message this sent to those who watched it unfold. How many others had been treated like this simply because of their race, their uniform, or their background? The officer's actions, although extreme, weren't unfamiliar. Carter had seen similar instances during his years of service, incidents where racial bias had infected law enforcement and even military ranks. But this one was different. It was public, it was bold, and it happened to someone with the platform and influence to speak out. As his car pulled into his driveway, Carter sighed, his thoughts still swirling. He knew he couldn't let this moment slip into the background. This wasn't just a personal injustice. This was a wake-up call for everyone. The next morning, Carter knew he had to speak out. He reached out to his contacts in the media, preparing to give a statement. He had made the decision to take his story public, not for revenge, but for change. It was time to shine a light on the broader issue of racial profiling and the abuse of power that had allowed someone like Officer Reynolds to act with such impunity. Within hours, news outlets across the country were covering the story. General Carter's name, long known in military circles, now began to trend on social media platforms. His statement was clear, calm, and compelling. What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It is a reality that many people, especially people of color, face every single day. It is a reality I should have never faced, but unfortunately, it's one that continues to persist in law enforcement. This is not just about one officer. This is about a culture that needs to change. He didn't stop there. He used his position and his platform to call for broader reforms. He called for police departments across the country to undergo bias training, for more transparent systems of accountability, and for better protections for victims of racial profiling. He spoke of unity, of the need for society to come together, not divide itself along racial lines. His message was a plea for justice, but more importantly, it was a call for healing. A call to dismantle a broken system and rebuild it with fairness and respect at its core. General Carter's speech went viral. The public's response was overwhelmingly positive, with many expressing their support for him and his stance. Civil rights organizations, political leaders, and military veterans rallied behind him, joining his call for reform. Some even called for the immediate resignation of Officer Mark Reynolds, citing his unprofessional conduct and clear display of racial bias. As the days passed, the story continued to develop. Officer Reynolds was placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. The local police department began to face mounting pressure to address the systemic issues within their ranks. Many began to question how deeply ingrained racism had become in law enforcement and whether enough was being done to root it out. In a rare public move, the police department issued a statement condemning Officer Reynolds' actions. The department acknowledged that what had transpired was unacceptable and promised to initiate a full review of its procedures to ensure such incidents wouldn't happen again. But while the department's statement was a step in the right direction, it wasn't enough for many. People demanded action, not just words. They wanted to see real change, real accountability, and real consequences for those who allowed systemic racism to flourish in law enforcement. And General Carter, who had never asked for this spotlight, found himself at the center of a nationwide movement. As the investigation into Officer Reynolds progressed, Carter was asked to testify before Congress. His testimony was compelling. He shared his personal experience, but he also highlighted the broader issue of racial profiling and the abuse of power. He spoke passionately about the need for meaningful reform in police training, about the importance of community trust, and about how to bridge the divide between law enforcement and the communities they are meant to protect. We can't fix this with half measures, Carter told lawmakers. We need real, systemic changes to restore trust and to ensure that no one is ever treated the way I was treated on that night. This isn't just about me. This is about every person who has ever felt unsafe because of their skin color or their uniform. The testimony sent shockwaves through the political landscape. Many lawmakers, both Democrat and Republican, found themselves agreeing on one thing. Something had to change. As Carter left the Capitol building, he was met with applause from civil rights activists and community leaders who had gathered outside in support of his efforts. Despite the overwhelming response in favor of change, the fight was far from over. Carter knew that the battle to reform law enforcement would be long and hard. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to listen. As he drove home that night, the sun setting on a day of monumental progress, Carter couldn't help but reflect on everything that had transpired. The arrest, the phone call, the public outcry. It had all led to this moment. He had been forced to confront the ugly realities of racism, but he had also seen the power of standing up, speaking out, and demanding justice. It was a pivotal moment, not just in his career, but in the ongoing fight for equality and justice. And as he looked out at the road ahead, he knew that the fight was far from over. But with every step forward, he was reminded that change was possible, and he would continue to lead that charge, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been unjustly detained, discriminated against, or silenced. The story of General Carter and Officer Reynolds serves as a powerful reminder that racism and injustice aren't just abstract problems. They're real, they're ongoing, and they affect people's lives every day. But this story also shows us the incredible power of standing up for what's right. General Carter's bravery didn't just shine a light on one officer's mistakes. It sparked a national conversation about accountability, equality, and systemic reform. If this story taught us anything, it's that change is possible when we confront the problem head-on. But it's not enough to just talk about it. We all must be part of the solution. If you believe in justice and equality, don't forget to subscribe and stay updated.